If you say, okay, I'm a leader of whatever it is, and my number one priority is to be popular, you will be the worst leader ever. Trust me. That's one of the best signs that you'll be a lousy leader.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. Leadership, it's a perennial interesting topic. There are thousands of books published every year. But what makes great leaders great? What's the secret? How did people like Lincoln, Churchill, Martin Luther King Jr. lead with such effectiveness? Well, that's what we'll discuss today with Bishop Robert Barron, who joins us from Rochester, Minnesota. Bishop, always good to be with you.
Hey, Brandon. Good morning to you. Always good to see you.
Before we were recording, you were telling me about a book you had recently picked up and enjoyed. It is titled The Thomistic Response to the Nouvelle Theologie, Concerning the Truth of Dogma and the Nature of Theology. It's an interesting book, and I was hoping you could maybe talk to our listeners and viewers about it.
Yeah, I'm preparing actually for a paper I have to give later in the year. And this is a book about what was the dominant theological issue prior to the council. That's fair to say. It's sort of a battle between the Rennian Thomism of the time, sort of a neo-scholastic Thomism that dominated Catholic thought, and then this newly emerging so-called Nouvelle Theologie, the new theology, that was much more animated by the Church Fathers, by the Scriptures, and more of a dialogue with modernity, etc. Okay, so this debate was joined, let's say, in the 30s, 40s, into the 50s, so mid-20th century. And it was the defining debate of the time. All the leading figures got involved in this thing. And then at Vatican II, it kind of spilled out into the conciliar debates. And I think it's fair to say, broadly speaking, the Nouvelle Theologie kind of carried the day at Vatican II. That's what makes it really interesting. Now, a further interesting point, I think, is when I was coming of age, so right after Vatican II, nobody talked about this. It was like this issue just disappeared. It fell off the table. It's been revived now in very recent years as the Thomists are kind of mounting a certain comeback against what they take to be maybe a now dominant Nouvelle Theologie. Anyway, some of this is, I know, for more technically minded theologians, but it's a very interesting, not just theological study, it's an interesting cultural study to me of why certain questions emerge and why they disappear. Why suddenly what was preoccupying thinkers in a few years no one is thinking about. And then why is it coming back today? Anyway, so I am finding the book kind of intriguing. Matthew, how do you say Minard? Matthew Minard is the editor of this book, right?
I think that's it, yeah. And what appeals to me about that topic is something Word on Fire's been promoting for several years now, which is the sort of both-and position of Thomism and Nouvelle Theologie. We might call it ressourcement theology. We don't have to choose, right? We can embrace the best from both.
Well, that's my perspective. As someone who kind of inherited both of these traditions, learned from both of them, reverenced both of them, and that's maybe it's an advantage that my generation has. We didn't see it as a terrible conflict. As everybody knows who's listened to me, I mean, I got into this whole game through Thomas Aquinas, and when I was a kid, I had no idea he was part of some grand debate going on. I just thought he was really interesting. And then later in my life, I read the Nouvelle Theologie people, and de Lubac and Danielou and Balthasar and Ratzinger and everybody else, and found them kind of wonderful and interesting. So, yes, I think you can do a both and very easily.
Let's talk about leadership. I'm not sure many people know that for many, many years you've been a leader, not just of Word on Fire, but of various institutions. You've led ministries, you led a seminary, you led a California region, now you're leading your own diocese. I know you've also read lots of books profiling great leaders. So let me begin with the most basic question. Based on your experience, based on your reading, what you've learned, what would you say is what makes great leaders great? What's the secret to great leadership?
Vision, seems to me. The leader's job is to provide a vision for the community, for the seminary, for the nation, for the church, whatever organization you're running. You're the visionary. And then your basic job is to make sure that there are people in place who share your vision and have the practical skill to implement it. I don't think the leader's job is the micromanagement of the process. It's the establishment and communication of the vision. That too, and some of the people we're going to talk about, is so important. The establishment and communication of the vision, and then the implementation of it through carefully chosen people who can make it a reality. I'd say that's the heart of it, Brandon, in my experience.
Well, I thought for the rest of this episode, we could look briefly at a handful of great leaders throughout history. Most of them are personal heroes of yours, and invite you to speak a little bit about each one, what made them a great leader, what we can learn from them. We'll begin with maybe the most obvious candidate, which is Jesus of Nazareth. And a caveat, we're not reducing Jesus just to a great human leader, but if he's the perfect man, then that means he had a perfected skill in leadership. So what can we learn from Jesus the leader?
Well, look at those two things I just mentioned. I mean, you see them par excellence in the Lord. The articulation of a vision. What's the first thing out of his mouth is the kingdom of God is at hand. And then he embodied that kingdom through certain gestures, through his own style of life. He set that as the great goal. And then talk about communication. Here's arguably the greatest communicator in the history of the human race. He was able to communicate this vision to people in a way that lifted them up and inspired them to follow him. And then, look, he chose, indeed, these collaborators, these 12 apostles, and then after them he chose wider groups of collaborators who would then embody this and carry it forth and make it happen. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. It means it wasn't going to end with him. He knew that he was giving rise to something that would now invade the rest of the world. So I think all of those are classic marks of leadership.
I think it's almost a cliche now. Many people have pointed out, but even though Jesus was a great leader, many of his followers left him. We think of John chapter 6 at the Bread of Life discourse. It says many left. Judas, of course, leaves and betrays him. All of his disciples eventually betray him. Can you talk about what it means that this greatest leader and communicator of all time, nevertheless, didn't really succeed in keeping all of his followers close with him and in line with his vision?
Right. Well, so it goes. And the last thing you said is really right. If people are not aligned with the vision, well, then, they will naturally fall away, and that's probably okay. If you're laying out a vision and you're saying, here's something I think worth achieving, and are you willing to follow me to achieve this? Great. Now, many won't. Many won't share that vision. Okay. Shake the dust from your feet. Move on. You're leading people that are willing to share your vision. Don't compromise the vision for the sake of numbers. It might be a way we put it today. Hey, your numbers are going down. Well, all right, but this is the vision. This is what we're supposed to be doing. So I think that's okay. Another feature that comes in here strongly, Brandon, is courage. Every great leader is marked by courage. And that's one face of it now. Do you have the courage to endure people who are abandoning you? Hey, the numbers are going down. People are going the other way. Well, all right, but because I've got my eyes fixed on the prize, and I have the courage to withstand unpopularity. People that don't like what I'm doing, don't like where I'm leading people. So it goes. You need courage to accompany the vision.
Let's fast forward several hundred years to the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. I think for a lot of people, especially in America, when you are asked to name a great leader, you think of one of the presidents, maybe Washington, often Lincoln. What was it about Abraham Lincoln that made him such a great leader?
Those two things. I've been studying Lincoln since I was 7 years old. I got a book on Lincoln when I was just a little kid, and I've been studying him my whole life. I have a great affection, admiration for Lincoln. I've got a picture of Lincoln up in my room. Lincoln was not a great nuts and bolts guy. Lincoln was not a great, micromanager. They say when he was elected president, he had to give, on his way to Washington, a couple of speeches to economic forums. And Lincoln barely understood what he was saying. He didn't understand, we'd call it macroeconomics. So someone put a speech in front of him and he read it. My point there is he wasn't a nuts and bolts, get down into the weeds kind of manager. But Lincoln knew better than any president in our history what was needed He had the vision. And for him, the vision was a united country that would eventually eliminate slavery. It wasn't just union, but it was a union that would lead to the eradication of slavery. And he knew that if you compromised on the union, that slavery would triumph, and so you'd lose both. So you got to hang on to the union, and then that will lead to the eradication of slavery. That was the vision. Laid it out, it got him elected, now through a very weird election of 1860, where there were so many candidates and Lincoln had a minority vote, but nevertheless got elected. Then, talk about courage. Withstanding enormous opposition, people leaving him in droves. His re-election in 1864 was seen to be highly unlikely. He was so unpopular as a president. But he stuck with it. He stuck with it in courage. And next thing, communication. No president in our history was a better communicator than Abraham Lincoln. He understood that essential to leadership, it wasn't just having the vision, it wasn't nuts and bolts micromanagement. It was the vision accompanied by communication. So from the first inaugural address, indeed the speeches he gave on the way to Washington, but then the first inaugural, most famously the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, and many others in between, Lincoln articulated in a compelling way, in a sort of lapidary way, this vision he had so that the country got it and they were willing to follow him. Something I haven't mentioned yet, decisiveness. If you got the vision, you've communicated it, you are courageously holding off, opposition, you also have to be decisive so that the vision can be maintained. Think of Lincoln now throughout the Civil War, firing general after general. But think of his dealing with General McClellan, who had certain gifts as a tactician and all that, but was a deeply disagreeable person and arrogant and dismissive of Lincoln. And people around Lincoln said, "Why are you tolerating this man? Why he's insulting you and he shows no respect for you." And Lincoln said, "If he helps me win this war, I'll hold his horse." Like he knew what he wanted. He had the vision. And he had the courage and the decisiveness. But then when it became clear, okay, this guy is now getting in the way of my vision, fired him, fired the next one, fired the next one, fired the next one, fired the next one, until he came to Ulysses S. Grant, who was able to achieve the vision. So Lincoln showed an extraordinary, courageous decisiveness in the course of the Civil War. Those are all the things that make him a great leader. Did he understand every detail of what the Treasury Department was doing? Certainly not. Certainly not. Was he a micromanager? No, I think the vast majority of great leaders are not micromanagers. It's the contrary. They're the courageous visionaries.
Doris Kearns Goodwin, the well-known and revered biographer of many historical figures, has a great book on Lincoln called Team of Rivals. She points out, as many biographers have, this unique characteristic of Lincoln as a leader to surround himself with people who don't just agree with him. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's part of that courage, isn't it? And if you got the vision, you know what you want. Okay, this guy doesn't like me. This guy is not on the same page as I am in many ways, but he can help me accomplish the goal. And this fellow over here can't stand that guy. But I'm going to bring the two of them together because together they're going to help me attain my goal. It was clarity about that, a willingness to put up with a lot. It was a lack of ego. Ego now in that very negative sense of, my ego comes first. No, the great leaders can transcend their own egos and say, we are trying to attain a common end here. Hey, Mr. President, that guy was bad-mouthing you, behind your back the other day. Well, all right, get in line, Lincoln probably would have said, But can he help me win the war? Then he stays in place. That's part of what I think she saw in the Team of Rivals thing.
Well, 9 years after Lincoln dies, another great leader is born. His name is Winston Churchill, probably the most revered figure from the early to mid-20th century, certainly in England. Talk about Churchill, the leader.
Same thing. Look at those two things. the vision. Now, Churchill, throughout his life, an extraordinary life, one of the most extraordinary lives of the 20th century. But at the decisive moment, see, he had read Hitler's book. A lot of people, Mein Kampf, Hitler writes this crazy, insane book in the 1920s. And most people think, oh, yeah, Mein Kampf, well, how crazy. Churchill actually read it. He read it, and he knew, okay, this is what this man wants. And the thing about Hitler wasn't hiding it. Hitler put right out there what he was going to do. So when he comes to power, Hitler comes to power. Churchill is out of power in England. But he begins to say, oh, hey, everybody, this man is very dangerous. This is what this man intends to do. Oh, Winston, come on, you're crazy. Thank God your career is washed up. Thank God you're out of the picture. Well, trust me, this man is very dangerous. And he kept putting forward this vision of what England had to do. And then, of course, at the decisive moment in 1940, when things were really desperate, they called upon Churchill. And he had the vision. He knew what England had to do. And it was more than England. He clearly understood what was at stake was Western civilization. He clearly understood that. Even more than, Roosevelt, I think, came around to getting that. But Churchill got it from the beginning. Then, what? At the level of Lincoln, someone who was able to communicate the vision, one of the greatest rhetoricians in English in the 20th century, and you can study him to your enormous profit of how to motivate people to act. But he communicated, especially in those great speeches from 1940, we will fight on the beaches, we will fight on the landing grounds, we will never give up, we will fight on the streets, we will never surrender. All I have to give you is blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Words that, these are decades later, and we're completely removed from that situation, but we still find them moving. Well, see, a great leader is like King David, who was, the sweet singer of the house of Israel. The King James has it so beautifully, right? David was a warrior and a political leader, and he was a poet. See, and that's very important. Lincoln was too. Lincoln was a great poet. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The leader has the vision and then the communication capacity and then the courage and decisiveness to carry out the vision.
What is it about Churchill that you think galvanized and drew so many people to him? Did he have this personal charisma? Was it his commitment to resilience, never give up, give in? I think there's lots of other leaders that have the qualities you just described: vision, decisiveness, surrounding yourself with a healthy team of rivals, etc., but nevertheless fail to draw people's attention and magnetize them. How did Churchill do it?
Well, he was the right man at the right time, and there he's like Lincoln, too. If Lincoln had emerged in the 1840s or the 1880s, he wouldn't have been Lincoln. He was the right man at the right time. He was the right man for that crisis moment in American history. That, catastrophe, as I think Shelby Foote put it that way, this catastrophe of the mid-19th century. But Lincoln was the man who was ready for that moment. The same with Churchill. Churchill had this somewhat checkered career, as a leader. He was widely criticized for a lot of his decisions, and he was in power, then out of power, and a lot of people had a good riddance. But he was the right man at the right time. If Churchill, let's say, had become prime minister in the 1930s or the 1950s, well, he was in the 50s too, but he wouldn't have been Churchill. I think it was his personality and style met the moment in just the right way.
Let's turn to another great leader of the 20th century here in America, Martin Luther King Jr., well known, of course, for inaugurating the civil rights movement. Talk about him and his leadership.
Same thing. See, it's such a common ground, isn't it? And we didn't really talk about this beforehand, but it's true, isn't it? King, what did he have? King wasn't a micromanager. King wasn't the guy that was down there, let's plot out how we're do the march and where should you go. And he was the man that had the vision. He began to articulate it, and he was a young, King dies at 39. It's amazing to think, now that I've reached my advanced age, to think he died at 39. So he begins very young as this, kind of bright, charismatic preacher, but he begins to lay out the vision, which was Bible-based, also tied to American values, and he began to see, okay, the segregation and oppression in America is repugnant to both our own national ideals and the Bible. And speaking out of those two traditions, he articulated the the vision, or he formulated the vision. But then, again, more than almost anybody else in the 20th century, he was able to sing it. Think about King when you listen to him. It's a bit like JFK that way. You listen to King, go on YouTube, is he's singing his sermons and his speeches. It's in the style of the black pulpit, but he was like a gospel singer. So he really was the sweet singer of America in the mid-20th century. And it was the coming together of those two strains that, at least at the time, were very strong in almost every American, the Bible and the American civil values. And King articulated it. He sang it in a persuasive way. And he had the courage of his convictions, leading to his own death, but the courage to stay with that vision. It's not the micromanagers. He gathered around him micromanagers. There were a lot of people that sort of micromanaged the details of the marches and the protests and all that. That wasn't King's thing. He was the visionary and the poet, the singer of the vision.
I don't want to shortchange King. We could do a whole episode on Martin Luther King. In fact, I think we have. If I remember correctly, The very first episode we ever did, it was the one on the 4 people that Pope Francis lifted up. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's right.
It was
Dorothy
Day and I think
Merton and Dorothy Day, King and Lincoln, wasn't it?
I can't remember.
Was Lincoln
we'll have to
the
go
fourth
back.
one?
Yeah. But I do want to make sure we have time for these last 2. Talk to us about Pope St. John Paul II as a leader. Obviously, he was the Pope for so many years. He was a major force in geopolitics. But what made him a great leader?
A broken record. It's the same thing. See, John Paul had the vision, which was, it seems to me, what was at the heart of Vatican II? He was a man of Vatican II. He was at the council, right, as a council father. And then he becomes Pope, and he knew the heart of Vatican II was evangelization, was going out to evangelize the modern world. So he had the vision, and then for 27 years as Pope, he articulated it. I think he was a rhetorician at the level of Lincoln or Churchill or King. He wasn't, but he was a steadfast proclaimer of that vision. Talk about courage, And again, John Paul was not a micromanager. John Paul was not hanging around the Roman Curia. In fact, they criticized him. He was always getting on an airplane flying somewhere. But see, he thought that was much more important than micromanaging the curial offices. But I think that's a common denominator, Brandon, is the great leaders don't do that. They'll get bogged down then. You get bogged down into internecine, conflict. Something else before we run out of time. We had talked about this, and it's true now of every single leader we've talked about, including and especially Jesus. Every leader who's good ends up being widely disliked. Now, let me explain why that's the case and what I mean by it. See, if you're the leader of whatever it is, corporation, institution, church, country, if an issue has come to you for adjudication, it is by definition a difficult issue. If it were easy, it would have been adjudicated way down the chain of command, right? So if it's come all the way to you, that means, this is a hard question. It's a thorny question. That means, furthermore, that there are good arguments on both sides. Let's say it's side A, side B, right? And they come to you, hey, which one do we do? Well, if it's come to you, that means there are good arguments for A and there are good arguments for B. All right? Now, you're a leader. You got the vision. You've communicated it. You want to move it forward. So I make a decision. A. Well, the A people think I'm brilliant. They think I'm a genius. The B people, that guy, what a loser. What an idiot. And they might be right because they got good arguments on their side, right? Okay, now that's one decision. Now a second decision comes along. Is it hard? Yeah, it wouldn't come to you unless it were hard. Good arguments on both sides? Yeah, it wouldn't come to you unless there were. All right, this time I'm going to decide B. Hey, the B people, they're happy for the moment. A people think I'm a complete idiot. Now, third decision, fourth decision, fifth decision, 6th, 100th, 500th decision. Every one of them is bloody, right? I said before, decision is related to the word scissors. They come from the caesare in Latin, which means to cut. When you decide something, You're cutting off one option, saying, I'm going this way. Well, what's happened is by the end of the day as a leader, you're covered in blood because you've been deciding left and right. So this Lincoln, Churchill, they were widely disparaged, right? All these King, they shot him to death. They were widely disparaged. That's where the courage of a leader has to come through. If you say, okay, I'm a leader of whatever it is, and my number one priority is to be popular, you will be the worst leader ever. Trust me. That's one of the best signs that you'll be a lousy leader. If you say, boy, my priority is to make everybody happy, because you won't, period. In fact, over time, you're going to make pretty much everybody unhappy with something you've done. So that's where you got to gird your loins, and you have to be courageous and stand your ground as a leader. One thing I think about in my role as bishop, when you become a bishop, they give you a ring. So I got this ring here. Well, that's a wedding ring, right? That says I'm now wedded to my people. That's a really powerful symbol. They give you a hat, the mitre. The mitre is saying, well, okay, you're the one we notice when you come in the church. We look to you because you're the shepherd. We have to know where you are. We have to see you. But then they give you a big stick, right? The crozier. Oh, what a nice bucolic symbol. That's not. Maybe it's bucolic, but it's not peaceful. The crozier on one end is a hook, because if the sheep wanders off, you got to go and get it and drag it back, right? On the other end, it's a stick to hold off predators. So it's, to me, very interesting that when a bishop sits down in his chair and the nuncio comes and gives him a big stick. Well, all right, that's kind of the tough side. That's the tough side of being a leader. And if you're unwilling ever to use it, oh no, that's too tough. Take that away. I will never use the crozier. Well, then you're not going to be much of a leader. So that's another common denominator. Everyone you mentioned, they were very, very widely disparaged. So it goes with leadership, I think.
Let's close with one more leader. Like John Paul II, this leader served for an extraordinarily long time. I'm thinking of Queen Elizabeth II, who just recently passed away, longest-serving monarch in British history. And another figure who paradoxically led for so long that she developed, everybody seemed to have a gripe with her. But on the other hand, by the time of her death, was still so widely beloved and respected as a leader. What was her secret?
She understood the symbolic dimension of leadership. And of course, that's the way the British system is set up, where she really doesn't have to make the decisions, and people know that, so they can blame the prime minister, and he's the one that's slicing away and covered in blood and all that, So the queen, in a way, is immune from that kind of critique. She, I think, understood better than anybody in the 20th century the symbolic power of leadership. That it's not just a matter of vision and of decision making. It's also it's a more mystical. It's a stranger, more symbolic thing. You know who had that, I think, in our country was Ronald Reagan. In my experience, Reagan understood the mystique of America and knew the mystique of the office of the president. If in my lifetime, I've heard occasionally that what we need is a good businessman in the White House. Someone that can really run the show like a good businessman. Well, I suppose that's a dimension of it, but that to me, it misses an awful lot of the mystique and the poetry of high leadership. I would say you need a poet and a visionary, and someone that does understand the mystique of the office. Who gave that to us, to his infinite credit, is George Washington. He understood the mystique of the office and the ethos of that office and bequeathed that to the last 230-some years. That was a great gift of George Washington. So I think Queen Elizabeth, she had that sensibility.
Well, as we finish up our episode on leadership, can I ask any tips or advice for listeners who aspire to become better leaders? They hear about all these figures. Maybe many of them think, look, I'm never going to be president, prime minister, queen. But how can I, in my ordinary life, become a better leader?
Let's say but you're a leader of your family. So a parent is a leader of the family. So everybody Most people will have that role. I would say those two things I talked about most prominently here is articulate a vision for people. What is where do you want this family to go? What do you want this family to be? And then embody that. Communicate it clearly. Stay on people so they stay on beam, Defend the vision. There's the crozier. You're holding off those who would want to undermine the vision. But I think the vision is the most important thing for a leader, that you know what you're about, where you want this diocese or family or country or church to go, and then become a poet who can communicate that vision well.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Each episode we take one, and if you have one for Bishop Barron, please send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today we hear from Nino, who lives in England. He's asking about the theodrama and the ego drama. Here's Nino's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Nino from Chelmsford in England. You've spoken recently about making sure that one doesn't act out an ego drama, but instead acts out a theodrama. How can I be sure right now which one I'm actually acting out? And are there any circumstances or situations where there's actually some overlap between the two? Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. Because it's not necessarily an either or, because what God wants to do is he wants to draw our individuality and personality into his sphere of influence. So he doesn't want us to suppress our mind and will and individuality. He wants to draw them up into his power. So a saint is someone, you might say, whose ego drama has coincided with the theodrama. Here, the basic thing is, am I operating out of self-interest or out of God's desire? So think of Augustine, city of God, city of man. The city of man is based upon self-love. The city of God is based upon love of God. So which one is it? And to be brutally honest in your own spiritual discernment. Am I doing this because I love myself and I want to propagate my own projects and my own reputation? Or am I doing this because God wants it? Now, what you're going to find is the more you follow what God wants, the more authentically and happily yourself you will become. That's the paradox. So the false self will fall away, and the true self will emerge. That's the coming together, if you want, of ego drama and theodrama. But I would say, is the drama being written, produced, and directed by God, or written, produced, and directed by you? If it's the former, then you're okay. Follow that one.
To wrap up our show here, I'd like to tell you about another new book from Word on Fire. This newest one is titled Evangelization and Ideology: How to Understand and Respond to the Political Culture. It's by our own Matthew Petrusik, who's one of the fellows of our Word on Fire Institute. This book offers an antidote to ideological thinking. Matt analyzes the philosophical foundations of four major secular ideologies of the day, including utilitarianism, liberalism, progressivism/wokeism, and non-theistic conservatism. Lots of isms that he's responding to. And Matt shows how Catholic teaching, while respecting the genuine concerns of these worldviews, nevertheless is the answer to their errors and deficiencies. So if you're interested in politics, political culture, many of these isms floating around today, and want to know how to understand and respond to them, check out this new book. Again, it's called Evangelization and Ideology by Matthew Petrusik. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.